The Ordnance Quick-Firing 17-pounder was a 76.2 mm gun developed by the United Kingdom during World War II. It was used as an anti-tank gun on its own carriage, as well as equipping a number of British tanks. It was the most effective Allied anti-tank gun of the war. Used with the APDS shot, it was capable of defeating all but the thickest armour on German tanks. It was used to outgun some foreign-built vehicles in British service, notably to produce the Sherman Firefly variant of the US M4 Sherman tank, giving British tank units the ability to hold their own against their German counterparts. In the anti-tank role, it was replaced after the war by the 120 mm bat recoilless rifle. As a tank gun, it was succeeded by the 84 mm 20-pounder. Development history. Gun development before the QF 6-pounder had entered service. The British predicted that it would soon be inadequate given the increasing armour of German tanks. In late 1940, design of a replacement was started, and was largely complete by the end of 1941. A prototype production line was set up that spring, and with the appearance of Tiger-I tanks in early 1943 in the North Africa, the first 100 prototype 17-pounder anti-tank guns were quickly sent to help counter this new threat. So great was the rush that they were sent before proper carriages had been developed, and the guns had to be mounted in the carriages of 25-pounder gun howitzers. These early weapons were known as 17/25-pounders and given the codename Pheasant. They first saw action in February 1943. Fully developed 17-pounders started production in 1943 and were first used during the Italian campaign. They became one of the most effective weapons on the battlefield, on both carriages and tanks. The 17-pounder anti-tank guns also saw action in Korea against tanks and in general support use against bunker positions. After Korea, the gun was largely replaced in the tank role by the Ordnance QF 20-pounder, and in the anti-tank role by the BAT, MOB 80 and 120 mm L6 Wombat series of recoilless rifles. Adaptation into tanks and AFVs. The 17-pounder outperformed all other Allied armor-piercing guns, and was quickly adapted for use on various tank chassis. However, few tanks were capable of carrying such a large gun due to size limitations of the turret rings. A new tank specification, A30, was produced to meet the need for a 17-pounder armed cruiser tank. The British developed a tank based on the Cromwell to mount the 17-pounder. The A30 specified cruiser Mark 8 Challenger provided a larger turret, allowing the 17-pounder to be mounted along with space for a second loader, required for the gun's larger ammunition. Production of the tank took time, however, and few could be completed before the Allied invasion of Normandy. While developing the Challenger tank, the British devised a conversion for the US-supplied M4 Sherman tanks to mount the 17-pounder. This was applied in sufficient numbers to put them into service in time for D-Day as the Sherman Firefly. The gun, a modified design that was produced specifically for the Firefly, was rotated through 90 degrees to mount into the turret of the Sherman, i.e., it lay on its side. An additional box was welded to the back of the turret to take the radio, which was moved to allow for the breech in its recoil. Production of the Challenger was cancelled, and more Shermans were converted until about 50% of Shermans in British service were Fireflies. The British also converted some of the US-produced M10 tank destroyers, replacing the 3-inch gun with the 17-pounder. The resulting vehicles were called 17 PDR SP Achilles, or just 17 PDR M10. These serve with Royal Artillery as self-propelled guns. The 17-pounder was also successfully trialled on the Australian-designed Sentinel tank, though no Sentinels equipped with this gun entered service with the Australian Army. A variant of the 17-pounder, the 77mm HV, was used on the Comet tank, a separate weapon. This fired 17-pounder projectiles in a more tank-compatible form factor, and ultimately replaced the need for 17-pounder tanks late in the war. As the war came to a close, the 17-pounder was also deployed on the Centurion tank until ultimately being replaced by the 20-pounder. The United States Army did not use the 17-pounder, though the gun was offered to U.S. forces with a number of Sherman tanks modified for testing. U.S. tanks moved to the 76mm gun M1 instead. Variants: Mark I first production versions. Mark II intended for tank use, removed the carrier mountings and replaced the muzzle brake with a counterweight. The brake was added back on in March 1944 with the introduction of the APDS shot. The Mk2 was used on the Archer tank destroyer and Challenger cruiser Mark VIII tank. Mark III Royal Navy adaptation for use on landing craft, generally similar to the Mk but included an automatic loading system. Unused. Mark IV another tank adaptation, this time with a different breech where the blocks lit to the side instead of down to take up less room. Used on Sherman Firefly. Mark V a version of the Mkiv with different mounts to allow it to replace the US 3-in gun M7 on the 3-in SP Wolverines, creating the 17 PDR SP Achilles. Mark VI another Mkiv adaptation with a shortened breech. Mark VII similar to the Mkiv, yet another change to the breech. Straussler conversion. This was an experimental gun, designed by Nicholas Straussler that was fitted with a motorized gun carriage. A modified ammunition limber would be attached to the gun's trails, making a four-wheel, self-propelled vehicle and removing the need for a truck to tow the gun. 77mm HV. The British started work on developing a gun that was small enough to fit on the tank designs, particularly the Cromwell cruiser tank. Then at the design stage, it was intended to fire the US 75mm projectiles at a high velocity, avoiding a downgrade in armor penetration versus the 6-pounder, which the dual-purpose 75mm was replacing. The new 50-caliber long gun, known as the Vickers HV 75mm, fired a 75mm projectile attached to a neck-down 3-inch 20-hundredweight AA gun cartridge through a modified breech. The larger 3 inches cartridge provided a greater propellant charge compared with normal 75mm shells. Although the 75mm HV was a promising weapon, it proved to be too big for the Cromwell tank, which was ultimately fitted with the normal QF 75mm gun in use on other British tanks. To account for this difference, tank squadrons were teamed with Challenger and Sherman Firefly tanks armed with the 17-pounder. When the Cromwell's replacement, the Comet, was at the design stage, the 75mm HV concept was reworked to fire the same projectiles as the 17-pounder through a shortened 17-pounder barrel, but retaining the 3-inch cartridge case firing from a standard 3-inch breech. This has the benefit of greater ease of use on tanks, many of which would not have sufficient turret space to accommodate the breech length and recoil distance of the 17-pounder. Similarly, the smaller 3 inches based ammunition was more easy to store and handle in the tank's cramped interior. This new gun's ammunition was not interchangeable level with the 17-pounder, however, and to prevent confusion over ammunition supplies, it was renamed the 77mm HV, the HV standing for high velocity, although it was the same 76.2mm caliber as the 17-pounder. This gun was used in the Comet tank ammunition. The 17-pounder used two types of anti-tank ammunition. Armor-piercing, capped ballistic capped ammunition could penetrate 163mm of armor at 500 meters and 150mm at 1000 meters. The armor-piercing discarding sabot could penetrate 256mm of armor at 500 meters and 233mm at 1000 meters, and allowing it in theory to penetrate the armor of even the German King Tiger heavy tank. However, the smaller tungsten core of APDS was considered to provide less accurate fire than APCBC ammunition at ranges beyond 500 yards. This was due to the much less visible impact of rounds that fell short, making it hard to spot the fall of shot and correct aim. The APDS was also considered to cause less damage to an enemy tank if it did penetrate the armor, but the sub-caliber tungsten steel core tended to destabilize after penetrating armor and ricochet around inside the target, causing crew casualties. APCBC ammunition was standard. APDS shot was used for about 6% of the average load of a 17-pounder equipped British tank. Most sources agree that APDS was not available on D-Day itself but reached Normandy in increasing amounts by the end of June or early July 1944. It was available for the breakout battle from Normandy and the advance to the Netherlands and Germany. The shell initially developed for the 17-pounder lacked power. Due to the high-powered cartridge, the shell walls had to be thicker to stand the stresses of firing, leaving less room for explosive. Reducing the size of the propelling charge for the shell allowed the use of a thinner-walled and more powerful shell. The 17-pounder produced a very large muzzle flash due to the large amount of propellant in its cartridges. Muzzle blast was also significant, described by Kruse of the anti-tank gun variant as resembling a hard slap on the chest. Performance. FH marks the performance against face-hardened armor, as opposed to rolled homogeneous armor. Use. Anti-tank gun. The 17-pounder was a much bulkier and heavier weapon than its predecessor. As a result, it had to be towed by a gun tractor, such as the Morris Quad M3 half-track or the Crusader, as it could not effectively be moved by its gun crew alone, especially on poor ground. After firing on soft ground, the 17-pounder frequently had to be pulled out of the ground due to the gun recoil burying the trail spades. After the Second World War, it was issued to anti-tank units of the Royal Artillery in the British Army of the Rhine towed by the M3 half-track. When the Royal Artillery anti-tank units were disbanded in 1951, it was transferred to infantry battalions in the BAOR, towed by the Oxford tracked carrier. It was later replaced by the 120mm BAT recoilless rifle anti-tank weapon, 25-pounder carriage stopgap measure named Pheasant. Split-trail carriage with gun shield, weight 3t, elevation -6 degrees to +16.5 degrees, traverse 60 degrees. Middle East. In the immediate post-war era in the Middle East, armies of Arab nations, Transjordan, Egypt, Syria and Iraq, used mostly British-manufactured artillery including the towed 17-pounder. The Israelis used a number of 17-pounders they captured from the Arabs in the War of Independence. Vehicle mount World War II tank, Cruiser, Challenger 200 built. Tank cruiser Comet I-1200 by end of war. SP 17-pounder Valentine MKI Archer tank destroyer built from Valentine tank hull. 655 built. Sherman Firefly about 2000. 17 PDRSP Achilles about 1100 by end of war. Tank infantry Black Prince. Australian cruiser tank MKIV, post-war Alvis Saracen, on heavily modified South African prototype chassis, Centurion on A41 prototype and on production Centurion Mk1 and Mk2. SP 17-pounder A30 not available in time for war. 250 built.